The first red flag was when she marched onto my driveway like she owned it. I was wiping down my Tesla after a weekend road trip when I heard the sharp click of heels on concrete. I turned, and there she was, HOA board president, Helena Zimmerman, 50-something with the permanent expression of someone who just bit into a lemon. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses too big for her face, and that awful beige visor that screamed, "I ruin neighborhood BBQs." "You can't park that here," she said, pointing to my driveway like it offended her personally. I glanced at my own driveway, then at her. "This is my house." "Doesn't matter," she snapped. HOA regulations clearly state that non-compliant electric vehicles must be stored in a garage. That model is known to interfere with neighborhood Wi-Fi. That's when I knew she was making stuff up again. "I'm Hugo Vance, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. I've reread the HOA bylaws more times than I care to admit, mostly because Helena keeps creatively interpreting them. Nowhere does it say anything about Teslas or Wi-Fi." "I'm not moving it," I said, opening the driver's door to grab my water bottle. That's when she stepped between me and the car. "You need to hand me the keys," she said, holding out her hand like she was entitled to them. "Until the board holds an emergency session and settles this violation, the vehicle will be impounded per HOA authority." I blinked at her. "That's not how any of this works." She huffed and pulled out her phone. "Then I'll call the sheriff." "You're refusing to comply with HOA enforcement, and I believe this car is stolen anyway." I actually laughed. "You think I stole my own car? It's not registered to anyone in the neighborhood," she shouted. "I checked your VIN this morning." That's when it hit me she'd been snooping around my property. Again, this wasn't about the car, this was Helena trying to flex her little HOA power trip. I didn't budge, she dialed anyway. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up. Deputy Carson stepped out, a guy I'd talked to before during one of Helena's previous false reports. He looked tired the moment he saw her. "This man stole my Tesla?" Helena barked before the deputy could say anything. "I demand you arrest him and return the vehicle to me immediately." Deputy Carson blinked. "Wait, this is your car." "Yes, I've been trying to recover it for days," she yelled, pointing at my Tesla like she'd raised it from birth. "She's lying," I said calmly. "I've got the title and registration inside. My name's Hugo Vance. The car's legally mine. She's the HOA president and thinks that gives her the right to seize private property." Carson looked at both of us, sighed, and asked to see my documents. I walked into my house, grabbed the folder from my office and handed him everything: registration, bill of sale, insurance, the works. Helena tried to snatch the papers, but Carson held her back. "Ma'am, trying to claim a vehicle that doesn't belong to you is a serious offense," he said flatly. "It's my word against his," she insisted, arms crossed. "And I'm on the HOA board. That gives me jurisdiction." Carson looked absolutely done. "That's not how jurisdiction works." Then she made her mistake. Helena stormed over to the Tesla, yanked open the door I hadn't locked, and jumped into the front seat. "If you won't enforce the law, I'll do it myself." Carson was already calling for backup. I just stood there, arms folded, watching the HOA president try to hijack my car in front of a sheriff. "You're about to get cuffed in a minute," Carson warned her, and she just shouted, "You'll be hearing from the HOA legal team," before slamming the door shut and fumbling for a non-existent key. Backup arrived 3 minutes later. By then, Helena had locked herself inside the Tesla and was yelling about sovereign HOA rights. The officers had to coax her out like a toddler refusing to leave Chuck E. Cheese. When they finally opened the door and pulled her out, she shrieked, "You're arresting the president of Maple Ridge Estates." "You're being arrested for attempted vehicle theft," Carson said, snapping the cuffs on, "and trespassing." Her face went pale. I leaned against my mailbox and sipped my water. "Guess HOA jurisdiction doesn't cover grand theft auto." By the time Helena was driven off in the back of the cruiser, Half the cul-de-sac had emerged from their houses pretending to water lawns or sweep driveways, trying not to look like they were watching. But they were. Everyone saw her shoved into the squad car shouting about bylaws and emergency sessions like it was some kind of political scandal. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. Helena wasn't just the HOA president, she was the kind who ran the board like a medieval court. She didn't compromise and she didn't forget. She'd crossed the line this time, sure, but people like her didn't go down easy. They regrouped. The next morning, I found out just how fast she could spin a narrative. I opened my mailbox and found a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a printed letter from the HOA board, stamped and signed not by Helena, but by Gregory Thorne, the vice president. It stated that I had violated community trust by provoking a board officer and that my personal behavior was under review for potential sanctions. I stood in the kitchen holding the paper, trying not to laugh. They were already trying to spin her arrest into my misconduct. Across the street, my neighbor Leela tapped on her window and waved me over. She was retired, kept to herself mostly, but today she looked irritated enough to talk. "I heard about yesterday," she said once I was on her porch. "That woman's been creeping around everyone's property for weeks." "You just happened to catch her red-handed." I raised the envelope. "Now they're claiming I endangered the HOA. Figures," she said, rolling her eyes. "They said the same thing about the Gutierrez family when they put up that garden archway. Next thing you know, there's a fine for unauthorized vertical structures." I glanced at my phone. "Mind if I record you saying that?" She looked surprised, but then nodded. "Go ahead. Someone needs to document this crap." By noon, I had 4 more neighbors on video sharing similar stories, fabricated violations, intimidation, even one elderly couple who said Helena threatened to tow their car because it had a bumper sticker she didn't like. I compiled the footage, added timestamps, and uploaded everything to a private drive, but something else had started to bother me. During the sheriff's visit, Helena had said she checked my VIN that morning. That meant she had been on my property before I even saw her again. The Tesla's VIN isn't visible from the street, especially not parked where it was. She must have stepped onto my driveway while I was gone, maybe more than once. I checked my security camera footage from the weekend. Sure enough, early Sunday morning while I was still on the road, Helena had strutted right up to the car, leaned in, and snapped photos. Then she wandered around the side gate, out of frame for 3 minutes, and reappeared carrying a clipboard and what looked like a small measuring tape. That wasn't HOA business. That was trespassing and possibly attempted tampering. I called Deputy Carson directly. "Look," I said, "I've got footage of her on my property while I was out of town. She didn't just try to steal the car she was casing it the day before." There was a pause. "You still have that footage?" he asked. "I've got everything archived. Email it to me, and if you're willing to give a full statement, we can add trespassing and possibly unlawful surveillance to the charges." Within the hour, I was at the sheriff's office giving a formal statement. They downloaded the footage, took screenshots, and added it all to the case file. One officer mentioned that the department had already received a few complaints about Helena over the past year, but this was the first time someone had provided concrete proof. When I returned home, something was different. My Tesla, previously parked in the driveway, was now boxed in on both sides by 2 unfamiliar SUVs. They were parked just close enough to make it difficult to open the driver's door. I checked the license plate's temporary tags from out of state. I knocked on the nearest doorhouse belonged to one of Helena's board allies, Marlene, a brittle woman who wore pearls just to walk her dog. She answered with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, though the tone made it clear she didn't want to. "Do you know whose cars those are?" I pointed. "They're blocking my driveway." "Oh," she said, almost gleefully. "That's my nephew and his friend visiting for the week. I told them to park wherever." I gestured to the curb. "There's plenty of street parking," she shrugged. "They didn't want to walk. Then they need to move the cars. Now," her smile dropped, Maybe if you weren't so hostile to the board, people wouldn't be so unfriendly. I didn't answer. I just walked back to my garage, pulled out my phone, and called a towing service. Then I checked the HOA policies. Yes, towing was allowed for vehicles obstructing driveways, even without warning, provided there was photographic evidence. Which I now had. 40 minutes later, both SUVs were on the back of two flatbeds. Marlene ran out shouting at the driver, threatening to call the HOA. "You go ahead and do that," I said, holding up the printed policy. "And tell them I'll be at the next board meeting with legal counsel." She paled but said nothing. Later that evening, a text came from Leela. "Gregory and 2 board members are going door to door asking people to sign something. I think it's about you." I stepped outside and, sure enough, spotted them halfway down the block with clipboards, knocking on doors. I walked down the sidewalk, not saying anything, until I stood behind them as they tried to convince an elderly couple to sign a petition. "Everything okay here?" I said, loud enough to make them jump. Gregory turned. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Vance." "Actually, I think it does." "What's the petition for?" "We're gathering support to remove disruptive influences from the community," he said, shoulders squaring. "Is that the official reason? Or is this damage control because your president tried to commit a felony?" He stepped forward. "You've made this personal." "You embarrassed Helena. She's been a pillar of this neighborhood for years." "She's in custody," I replied. "And I have footage of her trespassing. You want to defend that publicly?" He hesitated. "I'll be filing a restraining order tomorrow," I added. "If you or any board member sets foot on my property again, you'll be violating it." One of the other board members, a younger woman with a nervous expression, touched Gregory's arm. "Maybe we should just go." He didn't move. "I also submitted everything to the DA," I said. "They're opening a formal investigation into Helena's conduct. You think a petition's going to fix that?" Without another word, they left. That night, I got a call from Deputy Carson again. "You might want to be home tomorrow," he said. "Detectives are coming by to photograph the vehicle and take a formal inspection. They're treating this as more than just trespassing now. There might be evidence she tried to install a tracking device." I looked at the Tesla sitting quietly in the garage, suddenly understanding why Helena had been so desperate to get her hands on it. "Got it," I said. "I'll be ready." Detective Arlen Knox showed up just after sunrise, a tall man in a gray windbreaker who looked like he hadn't had a full night's sleep in a decade. He didn't bother with small talk. Just flashed his badge, asked to see the vehicle, and stepped into my garage like he was walking into a crime scene. Which apparently he now considered it to be. "Don't touch anything," he said, crouching next to the Tesla's rear wheel well. "We've got probable cause for illegal surveillance equipment." He and his partner, a younger woman named Detective Chu, began photographing the undercarriage, mirrors, and inside the wheel wells. Chu peeled back a small section of trim near the front bumper and paused. "Got something here." She reached in with tweezers and pulled out a small black device no larger than a matchbox. Knox gave a low whistle. "Custom GPS tracker, no serial, no manufacturer markings. This wasn't bought at the mall." I folded my arms. "Can you tell how long it's been there?" "Too early to say," Chu replied. "But there's dried adhesive residue. Whoever planted it didn't want it permanent, meant to be retrieved." Knox stood and looked at me directly for the first time. "You said the HOA president entered your property without permission?" "I've got time-stamped footage of her doing it, this weekend. She had something in her hand, could have been this." He nodded slowly. "We'll run forensics on it. If her prints are on that tracker, she's in serious trouble. Isn't she already?" "She's out on bail, but this changes things. Stolen property claims are one thing. Planting surveillance devices on a private citizen's vehicle, that's federal territory." Chu turned. "We'll need a statement from you detailing everything leading up to this, and we'll probably subpoena the HOA's meeting minutes." "Already ahead of you," I said. "I downloaded the last 6 months of minutes from their website, just in case." Knox raised an eyebrow. "Cautious man." I've lived here long enough. They left with the tracker sealed in an evidence bag, promising a follow-up once the lab report came in. I watched their unmarked sedan roll down the street and disappear around the corner. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing again. Not with gossip this time, but with actual movement. 2 residents were loading furniture into a moving truck. I didn't recognize them, but I recognized the expression on their faces, quiet frustration. Another couple was stapling a "for sale" sign into their lawn. I didn't blame them. Between the board harassment, the manufactured violations, and now the arrest of their president, the community's foundation was cracking. I spent the afternoon cataloging every email, letter, and notice I'd ever received from the HOA. There were dozens. Some were vague warnings, others were thinly veiled threats. One, dated 7 months ago, actually accused me of uncooperative landscaping. I organized them chronologically and flagged the ones signed by Helena. There was a pattern. Each escalation followed a board vote she'd lost. Later, I walked over to Leela's house again. She opened the door before I even knocked. "You saw the detectives?" she asked. "They found a tracker on my car," she blinked. "She was spying on you, looks like it." Leela stepped back and gestured me inside. Her living room smelled like cinnamon and old books. On her coffee table sat a cardboard banker's box full of papers. "I've been keeping things too," she said, pulling out an envelope. "Helena tried to fine me last year for removing a dying tree. Said it was a heritage species. I called a biologist. Turns out it was an invasive elm. I kept the report." I flipped through the envelope. She wasn't exaggerating. There was an official letter from the city's urban forestry department stating the tree posed a hazard and needed removal. "She fined you anyway," Leela nodded. $150, said the board overruled the city. I paid it just to avoid the drama. I looked at the box. How many others have stories like this? More than you'd think. Some are scared to speak up. Others don't think it matters. I stared at the papers for a long moment. It might matter now. Back at my place, I called an old friend, Melissa Crane, a municipal attorney I'd worked with years ago on a zoning dispute when I lived in another state. She picked up on the third ring. "What kind of mess are you in, Hugo?" I told her everything. The attempted car seizure, the arrest, the tracker, the retaliatory harassment. She listened silently, then asked a single question. "You have bylaws and financial statements." "Bylaws, yes. Financials, no." "Then that's step 1. By law, HOA members are entitled to inspect financial records upon written request. If they refuse, you can file a complaint with the state attorney general." I sat forward. What am I looking for? Misappropriation. Unauthorized spending. Any indication they've been using funds outside the scope of their charter. If Helena's been this bold in public, I guarantee she's been bolder with the budget. I drafted the request that evening and hand-delivered it to the HOA Dropbox. I made sure to take a photo of myself doing it time-stamped, just in case they claimed it never arrived. The next day I got a reply, not from the board, from a lawyer. The letter was printed on thick paper, embossed with a downtown law firm seal. It said my request was overly broad, disruptive, and potentially malicious in nature. It also warned that the HOA reserved the right to pursue civil remedies if I continued my pattern of interference. I read it twice, then laughed. They were panicking. Melissa wasn't amused. "That's a scare tactic," she said when I forwarded her the letter. "They're bluffing. Give them 10 business days to comply. If they don't, I'll file a notice of intent to sue on your behalf." That evening, my doorbell rang. It was the younger board member I'd seen with Gregory days earlier. Her name tag read Rachel, and she looked uneasy. "I wanted to talk," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "About what?" "I didn't know about the tracker," she said quickly. "I didn't sign off on anything like that. Helena handled security issues herself." "I swear." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "I'm not looking to burn anyone who didn't light the match," I said, "but I need to know how deep this goes." She hesitated, then pulled a folded document from her purse. This was supposed to be internal. It's a draft proposal Helena was working on. It outlines a plan to reclaim certain homeowner lots for community redevelopment. I unfolded the paper. It was a land use proposal, dated 3 weeks ago. Several properties were highlighted, including mine. She wanted to use HOA funds to purchase properties through forced fines and liens, Rachel whispered. Then sell them to a private developer she had ties to. She said it was a long-term vision, a way to modernize the neighborhood. I stared at the map. It wasn't modernization. It was theft dressed up in legalese. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I'm done," she said. She threatened to fine my parents for letting their dog off leash. "My dad's on oxygen. The dog's a support animal." I nodded. "You just made the right enemies." She left without another word. By the next evening, I had a full case file, surveillance footage, testimony, forged violations, the illegal tracker, and now a redevelopment plan that bordered on extortion. I sent it all to Melissa. She responded within the hour. "Get ready," she said. "I'm filing a petition for injunction and a formal complaint with the State Housing Board. If the judge grants discovery, we'll get access to everything: bank records, board emails, even Helena's private correspondences." The storm was coming, but this time I wasn't the target, they were. 3 days after the redevelopment draft was handed over to me, a courier knocked on my door with a thick envelope from the county court. It was the approval we'd been waiting for. A judge had granted preliminary discovery against the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, citing sufficient cause to investigate systemic abuse of authority and misuse of community funds. Melissa had moved quickly. She attached a handwritten sticky note to the front of the packet. "Let's see what they've been hiding under the rug." That same afternoon, a subpoena was served to the HOA's management office. An unassuming beige building tucked behind a dental clinic, it had always looked more like a neglected tax prep center than the command post of a neighborhood dictatorship. I didn't expect much resistance from the clerical staff. It wasn't their war. The real question was whether anyone on the board would try to obstruct the release of the records. They did. 4 hours after the subpoena was served, the HOA's lawyer, not the one who'd sent the earlier intimidation letter, but a new face, filed a motion to quash the discovery order on the grounds of irreparable reputational damage. The judge denied it within the hour. The paper trail was too damning, the tracker on my car too suspicious, and the testimonies from residents too numerous. This wasn't about reputations anymore. It was about criminal exposure. That night, I stood at my front window and watched as Gregory Thorne's porch light blinked on and off 3 times, then stayed dark. A pattern I'd noticed once or twice before. Subtle signals, likely between board members. But now I had cameras trained on every side of my house, and motion alerts piped directly to my phone. If they wanted to keep playing dirty, I was ready. The next morning, Detective Chu returned, this time with a warrant. "We found Helena's fingerprints on the GPS device," she said as she stepped into my foyer. "And we traced the purchase to a shell company registered in Nevada. The same LLC that recently wired a deposit to a regional developer tied to a few quiet land acquisitions in this area." I felt my jaw tighten. "You're saying she was preparing to sell off parts of the neighborhood using illegally obtained access and intimidation?" "Exactly that," Chu said. "And based on emails recovered from her cloud account, she planned to use forged violations to trigger property liens, then sweep in with the HOA's right of first refusal. It's calculated fraud." I sat down on the bench near the entryway. "She wasn't just power-hungry," I said. "She was running a racket," Chu nodded. "And now it's unraveling." By noon, the sheriff's office executed a search warrant at Helena's home. I didn't see it happen. She lived on the opposite side of the subdivision, but word spread fast. Residents who had previously whispered their complaints now spoke out openly. People who had stayed silent for years finally stepped forward. At the emergency community forum held that evening in the clubhouse, the atmosphere was electric. Residents packed the room shoulder to shoulder, murmuring as the interim moderator, a local teacher named Darnell, who'd volunteered to temporarily oversee the board, called the meeting to order. "This is not a coup," Darnell began. "This is a reckoning." He introduced a representative from the State Housing Authority who confirmed that an independent audit of the HOA's finances had been ordered. Copies of the redevelopment draft were handed out to each resident. Gasps rippled across the room as people found their addresses marked with color-coded annotations. Acquire, refit, demolish. Then Leela stepped forward, holding her stack of records. "I paid fines I didn't owe. I was harassed over my dying tree and I stayed quiet because I thought it was just me," she said, voice steady. "But it wasn't. And silence is what let her grow bold." Rachel was next. She confirmed that Helena had run board meetings off record, made unilateral decisions, and manipulated vote counts using proxy ballots from absentee owners who were never contacted. She revealed that Helena had even used HOA funds to pay for private security consultants under vague budget categories like infrastructure review and community safety enhancement. Then came the moment no one expected. Detective Knox entered the forum halfway through and asked to speak. He walked to the front, paused, and addressed the room. "As of this afternoon, Helena Zimmerman has been taken into custody again, this time on charges of wire fraud, illegal surveillance, abuse of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. We have sufficient evidence to believe she coordinated with a private developer to unlawfully acquire residential properties through deceptive and coercive means. Several HOA board members are also under investigation." A hush fell over the room. Even the most skeptical attendees sat frozen. "The investigation is ongoing," Knox continued, "but we're working closely with the state to ensure restitution is pursued for anyone financially impacted." The clap started slowly from the back. Then it spread. Applause filled the building, not joyful but cathartic. A pressure valve finally released. After the meeting, I stood outside near the community garden, the same one Helena once tried to ban for water overuse. Darnell joined me, his hands in his coat pockets. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said. "Neither did I replied. "But I'm not surprised anymore. What happens next? There'll be a vote to restructure the board," I said. "And the bylaws will need to be amended publicly, transparently. No more closed-door sessions, no more fake fines, no more fear." Darnell gave a slow nod. "We've got a lot of rebuilding to do." As I walked home, I passed several houses with their porch lights on and doors open. Neighbors were talking across lawns, helping each other stack recycling bins, laughing in a way that hadn't been heard on this street in a long time. The next week was a blur of legal filings, testimonies, and statements to the press. The local paper ran a front-page article. "HOA president arrested in fraud scheme, residents say enough." TV news, Vance showed up twice before the sheriff politely asked them to back off until the case was officially prosecuted. 3 of the board members resigned. Gregory tried to hang on but eventually stepped down under public pressure. The HOA's accounts were frozen pending audit results, and a court-appointed trustee was brought in to oversee operations until a new board could be legally re-elected. Melissa called me during the final week of October. "They're offering a settlement," she said. "The HOA's insurance carrier wants to avoid a civil suit, full reimbursement of all your legal fees, plus a public apology during the next recorded meeting." I leaned back in my chair. "What about the others?" "They're drawing up a fund for restitution." "Class action. Anyone who paid unlawful fines can apply for compensation." I took a long breath. "Then tell them they've got themselves a deal." At the November board meeting, held in the same clubhouse where Helena once ruled with a clipboard and a scowl, the new interim board chair read the apology aloud. "We, the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, acknowledge and deeply regret the actions taken by former board members, including the misuse of authority and violation of homeowner rights. We pledge full transparency, fair enforcement, and a complete audit of all past fines and assessments. I caught Leela's eye from across the room. She gave me a small nod, a quiet thank you. Outside, the neighborhood had started to change. The tension that once hung over every mailbox and driveway had lifted. A new sense of ownership not by the board but by the people had taken root. And as for my Tesla, still in the driveway, fully charged, right where it belonged.